The evening air inside the Vance estate was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax, a combination that usually signaled a house in perfect order. Eleanor Vance sat in her high-backed velvet chair, her hands resting calmly on the silk fabric of her dress. At 72, she had mastered the art of stillness. She watched the dust motes dancing in a stray beam of sunset, looking every bit the frail, aging widow the world expected her to be. Across the room, her daughter-in-law, Clara, was pacing, a restless, beautiful silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eleanor had built a real estate empire alongside her late husband, Victor, brick by brick and contract by contract. She knew how to read people better than she knew how to read balance sheets. For months, she had felt the shifting tectonic plates of her family's foundation. She noticed the way Clara's phone would vibrate at odd hours, always followed by a swift, silent exit to the terrace. She noticed the missing pieces of Victorian jewelry, heirlooms that had survived wars but couldn't survive Clara's secret debts. And most of all, she noticed the hollowness in her son Marcus's eyes. Marcus, once a vibrant architect, now looked like a ghost haunting his own hallways. He sat at the dinner table that night, picking at his sea base, unaware that his wife had already contacted 3 different high-stakes divorce attorneys. Clara, an ambitious former model who had traded her youth for a seat at the Vance table, believed Eleanor was finally slipping into the fog of senility. It was a convenient narrative. If Eleanor was senile and Marcus was unstable, Clara could claim the throne. "Eleanor, dear, you've hardly touched your wine," Clara said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. She stopped her pacing and leaned over Eleanor, adjusting a shawl that didn't need adjusting. It was a gesture of dominance disguised as care. "Are you feeling quite yourself today? Marcus and I were saying earlier that you seemed a bit disconnected." Eleanor offered a faint, trembling smile. "Oh, the mind is like an old attic, Clara. Sometimes it takes a while to find the right box. I was just thinking about Victor." Clara exchanged a knowing, pitying glance with Marcus, who only sighed and stared into his glass. This was the opening Clara had been waiting for. For weeks, she had been subtly gaslighting Marcus, moving his keys, forgetting to give him vital business messages, and then reacting with exaggerated fear whenever he grew frustrated. She was building a paper trail of emotional instability, a narrative that Marcus was becoming a man Eleanor could no longer trust with the family's vast holdings. Clara believed she was the director of this play. She had already secured a lover, a younger, handsome man with expensive tastes and no bank account. And they had spent hours whispering about the Vance fortune. Clara's plan was simple and brutal. Divorce Marcus, prove he was unfit to manage the estate, and force a settlement that would strip Eleanor's empire of its crown jewels. She saw the house, the offshore accounts, and the luxury properties as her rightful compensation for years of suffering in a cold, old-fashioned family. "Marcus is under so much stress," Clara continued, sitting down and reaching for her own glass. She sighed theatrically. "The company, the responsibilities, it's taking a toll on his temper. I'm worried, Eleanor. Truly worried. Yesterday, he yelled at the gardener for no reason at all. It was quite frightening." Marcus looked up, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his face. "Clara, the man was trampling the hydrangeas my father planted. I didn't yell, Clara interrupted, turning to Eleanor with a mournful expression. "So defensive. So quick to anger. It breaks my heart to see him like this." Eleanor watched the scene with the cold, analytical eye of a predator hidden in the brush. She saw the way Clara's hand shook slightly, not with sadness, but with the adrenaline of a successful lie. She saw her son's spirit breaking under the weight of a betrayal he couldn't yet name. Clara thought she was playing with a senile old woman, a relic of a bygone era who was too tired to fight back. What Clara didn't realize was that Eleanor's failing memory was actually a meticulous filing system. Eleanor remembered exactly where the missing brooches had gone. She had the security footage from the jeweler Clara had sold them to. She knew about the younger man, having hired a private investigator the moment Clara started working late at the gallery 3 nights a week. And she knew about the divorce lawyers, because Eleanor owned the building where Clara's lead attorney rented his office. The betrayal was perfect in its execution, but it was built on a fatal flaw: the assumption that Eleanor Vance was a victim. As Eleanor sat there, nodding vaguely and letting Clara ramble on about Marcus's supposed outbursts, she was already visualizing the final checkmate. Every move Clara made to alienate Marcus was another brick in the wall Eleanor was building to trap her. Clara leaned in closer, her eyes gleaming with artificial warmth. We only want what's best for the family legacy, Eleanor. If Marcus needs to take a step back, perhaps go away for a while to recover, I would be more than happy to manage things here with you. Eleanor reached out and patted Clara's hand. Her own hand was steady as a rock, though she let it flutter just enough to maintain the illusion. You're so thoughtful, Clara. A true blessing to this family. I don't know what I would do without a girl like you to keep us all in check. Clara's smile widened, sharp and predatory. She believed she had won. She believed the house, the money, and the power were already within her grasp. She saw the Vance empire as a ripe fruit ready to be plucked, never noticing the thorns hidden beneath the leaves. Eleanor Vance closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, a silence she was about to turn into a deafening roar. The play had begun, and Clara had no idea she wasn't the protagonist. The days following the dinner were marked by a chilling, calculated silence. Eleanor continued her masquerade, drifting through the sprawling hallways of the Vance estate like a ghost of her former self. She would often be found staring blankly at the portrait of Victor in the library, or forgetting to take her tea until it was stone cold. Clara watched these displays with a predatory satisfaction, convinced that the matriarch was finally losing her grip on reality. Every time Eleanor misplaced her glasses, which she had actually hidden in the folds of the library curtains, Clara would sigh with a performative pity that echoed loudly enough for the house staff to hear. Clara had accelerated her timeline. She was no longer just preparing, she was executing. Her secret meetings with her lover became more frequent, often held in the very properties Eleanor had spent decades acquiring. Clara believed she was untouchable, bolstered by the belief that Eleanor's mind was an old attic where the lights had finally gone out. She began to treat the household staff with a sharp, dismissive arrogance, already acting as if the deed to the estate bore her name alone. Marcus, meanwhile, was drowning. He spent his nights in his architectural studio, the lights burning until dawn as he tried to sketch designs that no longer felt inspired. The gaslighting had taken its toll. He started to doubt his own memories of conversations, convinced by Clara's constant corrections that he was losing his mind. Eleanor watched her son from the shadows, her heart aching with every slumped shoulder and every hesitant word he spoke. It was a high price to pay, but Eleanor knew that for the trap to work, Clara had to believe she had total control over Marcus's spirit. One afternoon, Eleanor sat in the sunroom, her lap covered by a heavy wool blanket despite the warmth of the day. She called Clara over with a frail, beckoning wave of her hand. Clara approached, her heels clicking sharply on the marble, a sound of triumph. "Clara dear," Eleanor whispered, her voice thin and wavering. "I've been thinking about what you said. About Marcus. About the unhappiness." Clara leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a simulated concern. "I know it's hard to face, Eleanor. But the marriage, it's becoming a cage for both of us. Marcus deserves peace, and I cannot live in fear of his moods anymore." Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling as she took Clara's. "I want you to be happy, child. You've been such a vibrant part of this house. If this marriage is a burden, I wouldn't want you to stay out of a sense of duty to an old woman." Clara struggled to hide her smile. She had expected a fight, a lecture on family values, or a desperate plea to stay. Instead, the senile Eleanor was practically opening the door for her. "You are so understanding, Eleanor. It's a relief to know you see the truth." "I see more than you think," Eleanor replied. A statement so double-edged it almost cut the air, but Clara was too blinded by her perceived victory to notice the sharpness. "In fact, I've told my lawyers that if a separation were to happen, I want it to be handled with extreme generosity. I don't want any bitterness to tarnish Victor's name." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Generosity. That was the magic word. She had been worried about a long, drawn-out legal battle over the Vance empire, but Eleanor was offering a shortcut. If she could convince the old woman to bypass the standard ironclad prenups and settlements, she wouldn't just get a portion of the fortune. She could walk away with the lion's share before Marcus even realized the papers were signed. "You're an angel, Eleanor," Clara said, her voice now genuinely breathless with greed. "I just want Marcus to be healthy. If we part as friends, maybe he can finally get the help he needs." "Precisely," Eleanor murmured, closing her eyes as if exhausted by the conversation. "Go on, dear. I need to rest. Tell Marcus I'll be in my room." As soon as the door clicked shut behind Clara, Eleanor's eyes snapped open. The frailty vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, steely focus. She stood up, discarded the wool blanket, and walked over to a hidden wall safe behind a landscape painting. She pulled out a leather-bound ledger, the real one. She began to document every move Clara made. She had recordings of Clara's lover bragging about how they were going to bleed the old bat dry. She had logs of Clara's secret bank transfers, which were being funneled into a shell company Eleanor had already flagged for the authorities. But Eleanor didn't want a prison sentence for Clara, not yet. She wanted a total, crushing defeat that would leave Clara with nothing but the weight of her own choices. Clara spent the rest of the week playing the role of the grieving wife to perfection. She staged accidents in the house, a broken vase here, a misplaced architectural model there, and blamed them on Marcus's blackouts. She whispered to the family doctor, a man Eleanor had known for 40 years, expressing her deep fear for Marcus's mental health. She was building a cage of evidence, unaware that the cage was actually being built around her. Marcus came to see Eleanor late one evening, his face haggard. "Mom, Clara thinks I should see a specialist. She says I've been acting erratic. Am I? I feel like I'm losing time." Eleanor took her son's hand, this time with a firm, grounding grip. "Marcus, look at me. Your father was an architect of buildings, but you are an architect of truth. Do not let someone else draw the blueprints of your mind." Marcus looked confused, the fog of gaslighting still thick. "But the things she says happened, the outbursts." "Wait, Marcus," Eleanor said softly, her voice returning to its deceptive, frail tone as she heard Clara's footsteps in the hall. "Everything will be clear soon. Just trust the family legacy." Clara entered the room then, her face a mask of worried devotion. "Marcus, honey, don't bother Eleanor. She needs her rest. Come, let's go look at those medical brochures I found." She led him away, throwing a triumphant, pitying look back at Eleanor. Eleanor simply watched them go, her face a blank canvas. She had given Clara exactly what she wanted. The belief that the Vance matriarch was a harmless spectator in her own downfall. The pieces were now in place. Clara believed she had a senile mother-in-law in her pocket and a broken husband at her feet. She was already mentally spending the millions she believed were her divorce gift. She didn't realize that Eleanor's ignorance was the most expensive thing she would ever encounter. The frail woman in the sunroom was merely waiting for the right moment to hand Clara the deed to her own destruction. Eleanor Vance didn't just build houses. She built traps for those who tried to burn them down. The air in the grand dining room felt heavier than usual, a suffocating mixture of unspoken resentment and artificial politeness. The massive mahogany table, which had hosted decades of Vance celebrations, now served as the stage for a final, cold negotiation. Eleanor sat at the head, her posture slightly slumped, her eyes glazed with a well-practiced vacancy. She watched Clara, who sat across from her, radiating a sharp, nervous energy. Marcus sat between them, a man hollowed out by months of psychological warfare, staring silently at the untouched steak on his plate. Clara was the first to break the silence. She cleared her throat, a sound that cut through the room like a blade. "Marcus and I have talked, Eleanor," she began, her voice steady but laced with a rehearsed sadness. "We both agree that for his health and for my own sanity, we cannot continue this way. The marriage is over. I've filed the papers this morning." Eleanor let out a soft, shaky breath, her hand fluttering to her chest. "Oh, my dear. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this. But I suppose freedom is a gift one cannot refuse when the heart is no longer in the home." Clara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a predatory focus. She had expected Marcus to fight, but he remained a silent spectator in his own life. This was her moment to secure the prize. "I don't want to be difficult, Eleanor. Truly. But I've spent the best years of my life building a home here. I deserve to be looked after." Of course, child, Eleanor murmured, her voice thin and yielding. Victor always said that family helps family, even when the family is parting ways. I don't want you to leave with nothing but memories. Eleanor signaled to a waiting assistant, who placed a sleek, black leather folder in front of Clara. Clara's fingers twitched with anticipation. She had spent weeks dreaming of this folder, imagining the rows of zeros and the deeds to prime Manhattan real estate. Marcus and I want you to have a fresh start, without any bitterness, Eleanor said, looking at Clara with a watery, desperate smile. As a divorce gift, I am offering you something truly special. Something Marcus doesn't even know I was holding in reserve. Clara opened the folder. Her eyes widened as she looked at a high-resolution photograph of a breathtaking luxury villa. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a glass and stone sanctuary perched on a jagged cliff overlooking a turquoise sea. The document attached was a deed, and the appraised value listed at the bottom made Clara's breath hitch in her throat. It was worth nearly $20 million, far more than she had hoped to squeeze out of a standard settlement. The Emerald Bay Estate, Eleanor whispered. It was Victor's last acquisition. It's private, stunning, and entirely yours. No strings, no shared ownership. A clean break for a new life. Clara scanned the pages, her mind racing. In her greed, she saw more than just a house. She saw a fortress where she could live with her lover, away from the prying eyes of the Vance social circle. She saw a liquid asset she could sell if she ever grew bored of the view. She saw total victory over the old woman sitting across from her. It's beautiful, Eleanor, Clara said, her voice genuine for the first time, though only because of the magnitude of the wealth before her. There is a settlement and gift agreement in the back, Eleanor continued, her tone almost apologetic. My lawyers are very old-fashioned, you see. They insisted that if I give you the villa and a lump sum of $5 million in cash, you must waive all future claims to the Vance business shares and the primary estate. They want to make sure the family company stays with Marcus, even in his current state. Clara barely heard the mention of Marcus. She was looking at the figure, a $20 million villa and $5 million in cash. It was a king's ransom. If she signed this, she would be set for life. She wouldn't have to spend years in court fighting Eleanor's high-priced legal team, or trying to prove Marcus was incompetent. She could have it all, right now. I think that's more than fair, Clara said quickly, reaching for the designer pen resting in the folder's spine. Clara, maybe you should have your lawyer look at that first, Marcus said, his voice weak but filled with a lingering sense of caution. Clara shot him a look of pure ice. Your mother is being incredibly generous, Marcus. Do you really want to drag this out? Do you want to spend the next 3 years in a courtroom talking about your episodes? Marcus flinched and looked away. The mention of his supposed instability was the final tether she cut. Clara turned back to Eleanor, her face a mask of false gratitude. I'll sign it, Eleanor. For the sake of the family peace. Clara scrawled her signature on the bottom of the agreement with a flourish. She felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made her lightheaded. She had done it. She had outplayed the legendary Eleanor Vance. She had taken the senile widow for every penny she was willing to give, and she had done it without breaking a sweat. Eleanor reached out and took the folder back, her hands trembling as she tucked the signed document away. Thank you, Clara. You've made a difficult day much easier. I'll have the keys delivered to you by tomorrow morning. You can start your move immediately. I think that's for the best, Clara said, standing up. She didn't even look at Marcus as she walked out of the room. She was already mentally decorating the Emerald Bay Villa, imagining the party she would host, and the look on her lover's face when she told him they were multimillionaires. As the sound of Clara's heels faded down the hall, the energy in the dining room shifted. Eleanor straightened her back, the frailty vanishing from her posture like a discarded costume. The glassy look in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, predatory brilliance. She looked at Marcus, who was still staring at the table. Marcus, Eleanor said, her voice now firm and resonant. Look at me. Marcus raised his head, startled by the sudden change in his mother's tone. Mom, what just happened? You just gave her the crown jewel of the portfolio. I gave her exactly what she wanted, Marcus, Eleanor said, a cold smile playing on her lips. I gave her the object of her own greed. I gave her a gift that she was too blinded by numbers to actually investigate. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, watching Clara's car pull out of the driveway. She thinks she's won a villa, Marcus. She thinks she's escaped the Vance shadow with a fortune in her pocket. Eleanor turned back to her son, her eyes flashing with the fire of a woman who had never lost a war. But Clara forgot the first rule of real estate. The most beautiful properties often have the deepest foundations of debt. She didn't read the fine print, Marcus. She was too busy looking at the appraised value to notice the liabilities. Eleanor reached out and patted Marcus's cheek, her hand steady and strong. Don't worry about your episodes anymore, my son. The fog is going to lift very soon. And when Clara realizes what she's actually signed, she'll find that the Emerald Bay Villa is a cage far more restrictive than this house ever was. In her bedroom, Clara was already packing her designer bags, humming a tune of triumph. She looked at the deed one more time, kissing the paper. She believed she had received the ultimate gift of freedom. She had no idea that Eleanor Vance had just handed her a golden anchor, and the tide was already coming in. The mahogany table was cleared, but the lingering scent of Clara's expensive perfume remained, a cloying reminder of the woman who had just signed away her future, while believing she had secured the world. Eleanor sat in the library, the settlement and gift agreement, resting on her lap. She ran a finger over Clara's flamboyant signature. It was the mark of a woman who had never learned that in the world of high finance, speed is often the enemy of survival. Clara had been so blinded by greed and the desire to move in with her lover immediately that she had bypassed every safeguard Eleanor had subtly nudged her away from. Earlier that afternoon, the Vance legal team, men with gray hair and eyes like flint, had arrived at the estate. They were not the family's usual corporate lawyers. They were specialists in liability and distressed assets. They had presented Clara with the thick folder, and as Eleanor watched from her velvet chair, she saw the precise moment Clara's common sense evaporated. Clara had scanned the appraisal for the Emerald Bay Villa, saw the $20 million figure, and stopped reading. She didn't look at the schedules attached to the back. She didn't look at the assumption of liabilities clause buried on page 42. Eleanor had maintained her frail facade until the very end, even offering Clara a pen with a trembling hand. It's a golden bridge, Clara, Eleanor had whispered. Take it and be happy. Clara had snatched the pen, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and pity for the senile woman she thought she was fleecing. By signing that document, Clara had officially waived all future rights to Marcus's business shares and the family estate. She had traded a secure, multi-generational fortune for a single, shining object that was, in reality, a meticulously crafted trap. Marcus entered the library, looking more alert than he had in months. The absence of Clara's constant, disparaging whispers was already acting like a tonic. He watched his mother, seeing the steely resolve that had returned to her face. Mom, the lawyer said the transfer is complete. She's already at the house, packing the last of her things. She's taking the Bentley. Let her take the car, Marcus, Eleanor said, her voice now cold and resonant. It will be the last thing she owns that actually works. I still don't understand, Marcus admitted, sitting across from her. The Emerald Bay Villa. I know we struggled with that project. The land was beautiful, but the structural issues were a nightmare. Why give her something so valuable if we wanted her gone? Eleanor leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp planes of her face. Value is an illusion created by a balance sheet, Marcus. Clara saw a $20 million asset. What she failed to see was the golden trap I spent the last 6 months preparing. Eleanor opened the folder and pointed to the fine print Clara had ignored. The Emerald Bay estate is not just a house. It is the center of a legal hurricane. 3 months ago, I quietly moved several of our most distressed subsidiary debts into the holding company that owns that villa. By signing the settlement and gift agreement, Clara didn't just accept a house, she accepted the personification of a debt-ridden shell company. Marcus scanned the document, his eyes widening. She agreed to an unconditional assumption of all corporate liabilities associated with the holding company in exchange for the deed. Exactly, Eleanor murmured. She believed she was getting a fresh start without bitterness. Instead, She signed a document that states she waives all claims to the Vance fortune and accepts personal responsibility for every debt attached to Emerald Bay. Clara, meanwhile, was upstairs in the master suite, tossing silk dresses into Louis Vuitton trunks. Her lover was on the phone, his voice a jubilant shout as she told him about the $5 million cash transfer. They were planning a life of endless summer, a world of yachts and high-stakes galas where Clara would finally be the queen she was meant to be. She felt a sense of intoxicating power. She had outplayed Eleanor Vance. She had survived the stifling Vance family and come out with more money than her parents had made in 3 lifetimes. She didn't notice the way the Vance house staff watched her. Not with the usual fearful respect, but with a strange, silent anticipation. They had seen Eleanor Vance in action before. They knew that when the mistress of the house gave a gift that seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Eleanor walked to the window, watching Clara's lover pull up in a flashy sports car to help with the final bags. She thinks she's winning, Marcus. She thinks she's the one walking away with the prize. She has no idea that the moment she stepped through the doors of Emerald Bay, she would be stepping into a cage of her own making. What happens when she realizes? Marcus asked. By then it will be too late, Eleanor replied. The blockchain records of her signature are permanent. The liability transfers are ironclad. She traded the Vance name for a glass house built on a foundation of quicksand. She wanted a clean break, and I have given it to her. As Clara walked out the front door for the last time, she didn't even look back at the mansion. She climbed into the Bentley, her lover beside her, and sped toward the coast. She felt light, free, and incredibly rich. She had no idea that the golden trap had already snapped shut the moment the ink dried on the paper. She was heading toward a $20 million debt she couldn't pay and a lawsuit she couldn't win. All while Eleanor Vance sat in her library, finally breathing the clean, quiet air of a house that was hers once again. The morning of the move was bathed in a deceptive, brilliant sunshine that made the coastline of Emerald Bay shimmer like a promise. Clara sat in the passenger seat of the Bentley, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather-bound folder Eleanor had given her. Beside her, her lover, Julian, drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting confidently on her knee. They were a portrait of modern success, fleeing the dusty shadows of the Vance estate for a life of their own making. I still can't believe the old woman just rolled over, Julian said, his voice filled with a smug, triumphant energy. 20 million for the villa, 5 million in the bank. We're set, Clara. We never have to look back. Clara smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that finally had the freedom to remain on her face. She was never a match for us, Julian. Eleanor is a relic. She thinks a few kind words and a divorce gift can make up for the fact that she's lost her son and her grip on the world. As they pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of the Emerald Bay estate, the sheer opulence of the property took Clara's breath away. The villa was a masterpiece of glass and steel, perched precariously but beautifully on a jagged cliff overlooking the turquoise sea. It was a sanctuary that whispered of power and exclusivity. A fleet of moving trucks was already stationed in the circular driveway, and a team of professional organizers was busy carrying her Louis Vuitton trunks and designer furniture into the foyer. Clara stepped out of the car, the salt air catching her hair. She felt like a queen entering her kingdom. The house was even more stunning than the photographs in the legal folder. Every room was filled with high-end technology and designer furniture that Eleanor had insisted remain with the property as part of the clean break. She walked onto the sprawling marble terrace, looking out over the infinity pool that seemed to merge with the ocean beyond. This was the fresh start Eleanor had promised, a life without bitterness. Clara pulled her phone from her silk pocket and began recording a video. She panned the camera across the breathtaking view, the sparkling pool, and finally landed on her own triumphant face as Julian stepped up behind her, popping a bottle of expensive champagne. To the Vance matriarch, Clara said to the camera, her voice dripping with irony. Thank you for the gift, Eleanor. You were right, it really is a new life. She hit send, imagining the senile woman sitting in her dim library, watching the video and realizing she had been outplayed. The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of champagne and celebration. Clara wandered through the 12 bedrooms, imagining which ones they would transform into a private gym and a high-end gallery for the art she planned to buy with her $5 million cash settlement. She felt an intoxicating sense of power. She had survived the suffocating Vance family and emerged with a fortune that made her untouchable. Julian was already talking about the yacht they would commission. "We should name it the Great Escape," he joked, lifting his glass, "in honor of the old bat who paid for it." Clara laughed, the sound echoing through the minimalist halls of the villa. She felt invincible. She had successfully manipulated Marcus's spirit until he was a ghost in his own home, and she had convinced Eleanor that she was a devoted daughter-in-law, until the very moment the ink dried on the settlement papers. She believed she had won a grand move-in into a life of endless summer and high-stakes galas. However, back at the Vance estate, the atmosphere was far from defeated. Eleanor sat in her study, her back straight and her eyes filled with a predatory brilliance. On the screen of her tablet, she watched the video Clara had sent. She didn't look angry. She didn't look senile. She looked like a woman who had just watched a fly land exactly in the center of a spider's web. "She's there, Marcus," Eleanor said calmly, setting the tablet aside. "She's drinking the champagne. She's walking the terrace. She's celebrating her victory." Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the gardens his father had planted. The fog of the last few months was lifting rapidly. He felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. "And the trucks. The moving trucks are the final piece," Eleanor murmured. By moving her primary residence to Emerald Bay and bringing her assets into that house, she has legally solidified the assumption of liabilities clause. She hasn't just accepted the house. She has officially anchored herself to the debt. Eleanor leaned back in her velvet chair, a cold, steady focus in her gaze. Clara thinks she is the director of this play. She believes she is the one walking away with the prize. She has no idea that the Emerald Bay Villa is not a home. It is a meticulously crafted cage. Clara, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon, stood on her new terrace as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. She felt light and free. She believed she was the woman people were supposed to see next to a fortune like this. She had no idea that the invisible debt was already vibrating through the foundations of the house, and that the generous gift Eleanor had handed her was designed to burn her world down the moment she felt most secure. The first night in the villa was filled with the sounds of the ocean and Julian's jubilant laughter. Clara fell asleep in a master suite that cost more than most people's entire lives, clutching the deed to her chest like a holy relic. She was a multimillionaire. She was free. She was a Vance no longer. She had no idea that tomorrow morning, the first of the bailiffs would be at the gate, and the $20 million view would be the last thing she would ever truly own. Eleanor Vance didn't just build traps. She built them out of the very things her enemies desired most. And Clara, in her terminal greed, had walked into this one with a smile on her face. The first morning at Emerald Bay did not begin with the gentle sound of waves, but with the sharp, rhythmic pounding of a heavy brass knocker against the front door. Clara, wrapped in a silk robe that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, frowned as she checked the time on her diamond-encrusted watch. It was barely 8 in the morning. She expected her coffee to be served on the terrace, not to be disturbed by unannounced visitors. Julian was still asleep in the master suite, dreaming of the yacht they had discussed the night before. Clara walked down the grand marble staircase, her heels clicking with an irritation she no longer felt the need to hide. She pulled open the massive oak door, ready to berate whatever delivery person had dared to arrive so early. However, the words died in her throat. Standing on the circular driveway was not a courier, but a small team of men in somber charcoal suits, led by an official-looking individual holding a thick stack of legal documents. Behind them stood 2 bailiffs and several representatives from a major international bank. "Clara Vance?" the lead man asked, his voice as cold as the morning mist. "It's just Clara now," she snapped, recovering her poise. "And who are you? This is private property. You're trespassing." The man did not flinch. "My name is Arthur Penhaligon, lead counsel for the secondary creditors of the Emerald Bay Holding Company. We are here to serve notice of a constructive seizure and a series of emergency injunctions." Clara let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You've made a mistake. I have the deed. Eleanor Vance gave me this house as a gift, a clean break. There are no creditors. Ms. Clara, if you look at the settlement and gift agreement you signed 3 days ago, you will find that you did not just accept a house, Arthur said, handing her a document that made her heart skip a beat. You accepted the unconditional assumption of all liabilities associated with the holding company that owns this deed. Clara's fingers trembled as she snatched the paper. Her eyes darted across the text. Buried in the fine print she had ignored, the same pages she had bypassed in her rush to escape Eleanor's shadow, was a clause that acted like a poison pill. Eleanor had quietly funneled several of the Vance Empire's most distressed subsidiary debts, totaling over $40 million, into the Emerald Bay Shell Company just weeks before the divorce. This house is worth $20 million, Clara shouted, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. Even if there's debt, the asset covers it. Actually, Arthur replied almost pityingly, the house is currently unmarketable. As of 6 months ago, the Coastal Commission filed a massive environmental lawsuit regarding the cliffside stability and the illegal drainage systems installed by the previous developers. The fines are accruing at $50,000 a day. Because you signed the assumption of liabilities, you are now personally responsible for those fines and the $40 million debt. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. The invisible debt Eleanor had meticulously prepared was now vibrating through the very foundation of the luxury villa. By moving her primary residence here and bringing all her personal belongings into the house, she had legally solidified her position as the primary target for the creditors. Where is the cash? Julian asked, appearing at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, his face pale as he overheard the conversation. The $5 million Eleanor transferred. Already frozen, Arthur said simply. A court order was placed on that account at dawn as collateral for the outstanding interest payments on the subsidiary debts. Clara looked around the grand foyer, at the designer furniture and the expensive art she had bragged about in her video to Eleanor. Suddenly, the beautiful glass walls didn't look like a palace. They looked like the walls of a cage. The generous gift was a golden anchor designed to pull her under the moment she felt most secure. Eleanor Vance had played her perfectly. She had used Clara's terminal greed as the bait for a trap that had now snapped shut. Clara had traded a seat at the Vance table, a position of protected wealth and multi-generational security, for a debt-ridden shell company and a house that was legally crumbling into the sea. I need to call my lawyer, Clara whispered, her bravado evaporating. You can call whoever you like, Arthur said, turning to signal the bailiffs to begin the inventory. But by tonight, this property will be under full receivership. You have 12 hours to vacate, but the contents of the house, which you legally transferred to the holding company as part of your move-in, now belong to the creditors. As the bailiff stepped past her into her kingdom, Clara felt a cold, crushing defeat. She had believed she was the director of this play, that she was the one walking away with the prize. She had no idea that Eleanor's failing memory was a mask for a mind that never forgot a betrayal. Back at the Vance estate, Eleanor sat in her library, sipping a hot tea that was no longer stone cold. Marcus sat across from her, reading a news alert about the emergency injunctions at Emerald Bay. The air in the house was finally clean and quiet. Is it done? Marcus asked. It is, Eleanor murmured, a small, cold smile touching her lips. Clara wanted a clean break. She wanted to be the woman people saw next to a fortune. Now they will see her exactly as she is, a woman buried under the weight of her own choices. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet gardens. She didn't look like a senile widow. She looked like the architect of a total, crushing victory. She had given Clara exactly what she desired most, knowing that greed is the most effective cage of all. The coastal fog began to roll in over Emerald Bay, chilling the marble floors and blurring the lines between the luxury villa and the gray, indifferent sea. Inside the glass walls, the air of triumph had been replaced by the frantic, hollow sounds of defeat. Bailiffs moved with silent, mechanical efficiency, cataloging the designer furniture and silk rugs that Clara had bragged about only 24 hours earlier. Every item she had brought into the house as part of her grand move-in was now legally tethered to the massive debts of the Emerald Bay Holding Company. Clara stood on the terrace, her silk robe fluttering in the damp wind, watching as Julian argued with a bank representative in the foyer. The younger man's face was no longer handsome. It was contorted with a mixture of fear and growing resentment. He had been promised a life of yachts and high-stakes galas, but he had found himself trapped in a legal hurricane. When he looked at Clara now, he didn't see a queen, he saw a liability. "I need to talk to Eleanor," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the crashing waves below. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. She dialed the Vance estate, her breath hitching as the line rang. The call was answered on the second ring. "Vance residence," a calm, familiar voice said. "Eleanor," Clara gasped, her bravado finally, completely shattered. "Eleanor, there's been a mistake. The bank, the bailiffs, they're taking everything. You have to stop them. You gave me this house. You promised a fresh start without bitterness." There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was no longer thin or wavering. It was the resonant, steely voice of the woman who had built an empire from nothing. "I didn't promise you a fresh start, Clara. I promised you a gift that matched your heart," Eleanor said, each word landing like a gavel. "You wanted the villa. You wanted the cash. You wanted to walk away with the prize before Marcus even realized the papers were signed. I simply allowed you to take exactly what you desired most. You trapped me," Clara screamed, looking at the bailiffs who were now moving toward her Louis Vuitton trunks. "You moved the debts. You knew about the environmental lawsuits." "I knew about everything, Clara," Eleanor replied calmly. "I knew about the missing brooches you sold. I knew about the late-night meetings with Julian. And I knew that your greed would prevent you from reading page 42 of the agreement. You traded the Vance name and 46 years of family legacy for a debt-ridden shell company. You chose a glass house built on quicksand." "I'll sue you," Clara vowed, though her voice broke. "With what money?" Eleanor asked quietly. "The $5 million is frozen to cover interest. The villa is in receivership. You signed an ironclad waiver of all future claims to the Vance fortune. You are no longer a toxic element in my son's life. You are simply a woman buried under the weight of her own choices." The line went dead. Clara dropped the phone. It clattered against the marble, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracks. She looked back into the foyer. Julian was already walking toward his sports car, carrying nothing but his own leather jacket. He didn't look back at her. The great escape he had joked about was now his own, leaving her behind in the wreckage. Back at the Vance estate, Eleanor sat in the library with Marcus. The room was finally quiet, the cloying scent of Clara's perfume replaced by the honest smell of old books and fireplace wood. Marcus looked at his mother, seeing her not as a frail widow, but as the architect of a total, crushing victory. The gaslighting had ended. The fog had lifted. "What happens to her now?" Marcus asked. "She will spend the next decade in courtrooms, Marcus," Eleanor said, sipping a tea that was no longer stone cold. "The creditors will follow her for every penny she ever makes. The divorce gift was a golden anchor, and she is now firmly at the bottom of the bay." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, watching the moonlight settle over the quiet gardens. She had successfully removed the toxic element from their lives, protecting her son's spirit and her husband's legacy in one final, decisive move. She had played the role of the victim perfectly, knowing that greed is the most effective cage of all. "Your father used to say that buildings are easy to design, but a life requires a far more complex blueprint," Eleanor murmured, turning to her son with a steady, grounding smile. "Tonight, Marcus, the blueprints are finally correct." The Vance empire remained intact. The estate was secure. And as Eleanor looked out over the empire she had saved, she knew that the truth didn't need to be loud to be powerful. It only needed to be recorded, verified, and delivered with the precision of a woman who never forgot a betrayal. Clara was left with a debt-ridden mansion and a tarnished reputation, while Eleanor and Marcus finally enjoyed their peace. The house finally belonging to those who truly understood the value of what was inside its walls.